as we discussed earlier, unfortunately we don't have that many new turners here tonight, but we'll still give it a shot. Goal was, and again, I think I said this last time, when Mike Peace and I were talking about his demo coming up, which was months ago, we talked about how oftentimes we either cut the demonstrator short or we cut the show and tell kind of question short. So the question here tonight was to not cut the show and tell and follow-on discussion short, but to devote it to people's work that they're either have worked on, are working on, or would like to work on, and are stuck with the problem, or conversely, if you've done something and, you know, promises, what have you, gave us great insights as to how you do your work, but not just Turner question. So I'll go first simply because Thomas and I talked about this earlier, but I have not turned very many natural edge bowls. This was a pair that John Kelsey gave me. It started out quite a bit larger. I managed to whittle it down to size. But on several of them, and I'm getting better because I've turned several more afterwards and I'm having less and less of this. But the wing, I kept getting tool marks. And Thomas suggested that but they didn't have the tool firmly enough on the tool rest. By the time it came around, it was moving slightly. So that was your suggestion, one way, and plus to keep turning more of these, and I'll get a feel for how to approach. But certainly experience helps, but it's also nice to have folks that come through the and say, oh, X, Y, and Z, and it's like, oh, wow.
The other thing I didn't say, so you can make a whisper cut, right? So that, yeah.
Interestingly, when I was down at Ellsworth's, his interior finishing cut was getting still gives me because
supine.
Is that what he calls it?
I don't know what he calls it, but he's got the bevel at.
He's got the bevel that's sitting straight up, and he just dips it slightly into the edge of the bowl. And every time he did that, you know, I was having major catches.
He calls it the suicide cut.
And he just smiled. He goes, try it again, try it again, try it again. So the 3 or 4 natural edge bowls that I came back with all have the same problem. I kept getting catches every time I tried that.
Well, what was my other suggestion on how to solve that?
Well, just keep turning.
Do 20 more of them.
Do 20 more.
Yeah, and that was Dave's teaching approach to the inside his finishing cut.
Right.
You can't expect to do it on the first try.
Right.
You got to just keep going at it.
Yeah. And it was totally counterintuitive to me because it's not what I've been doing. I've been doing the cutting on the bottom edge, going in like this, and he does it on the left edge, and he gets the finest cut you can imagine. So anyhow, that's kind of what I was thinking we would talk about. Tom was talking about trying to get to the bottom of some of his bowls. You know,
well,
how
actually,
you
I
do
have
that.
the same issue. I can pass it around so you can. I had actually the same issue when I brought this bowl. These kind of tool marks.
Yeah.
So I think that's what he's talking about. Because I've been turning bowls about a year. I have the same issue, but my issue is green wood.
Can you show us on the camera here so we can see it from the zoom in on it?
So right.
Yeah, just at the top inch or so. I think that's where your issue is, right, John?
Yeah, my issue with these is on the wings, and I doubt that you can see it.
I get those.
I don't know if you can see it in here because it's so far away. But you can see a line,
I get this.
right?
Yeah.
And I could have sanded the hell out of it and just kept sanding and sanding and sanding, but at some point I thought, I'm just going to leave it like that to remind me that I need to work on it. Because otherwise, I basically would have sanded a bowl, which is not the goal.
Back to the preserving the bark. Do you go ahead and turn the outside and then saturate the bark with CA, or you can't turn both inside and outside, or unless it's an ideal bark situation, the bark comes flying off. So
Don't you start it on the outside, you should start the bark edge.
Push it in.
Into the bowl. Not start the bowl edge out the bark.
what I'm saying is you're going to saturate, you're going to put the CA on the bark once you turn the outer edge, or the outside, before you do the inside, so that the bark isn't free standing on both sides.
Well, I think the people behind me would tell you to turn wood that's been cut down in the dead of winter, and don't try to make a natural edge bowl out of a piece of wood that has bark doesn't want to stay on it. You can CA glue it, but it's never going to, right? Like,
Well, let me say on this little dogwood thing I made, the bark was seemingly very well attached. And a half hour later, pieces began to fly off, but I had done both the top and the bottom.
when you cut the bark on the bottom, did you go from the bowl to the bark, or did you go from the bark to the bowl?
Well, keep in mind, this is
It's a natural edge bowl.
it's not a round object, it's a three-winged, so it's,
Oh, right, you're talking about the bark on that. So, and you said that was cut in the winter?
it was cut what?
In the winter?
Yeah, it was delivered to me in after Christmas, and I put sealer on the edges, and so it's been sitting on my garage floor for about 5 months.
Mike, do you have a suggestion?
You're gonna,
But I've done a piece of mulberry that was felled that day by my neighbor, and I decided to do it as a live edge bowl, and that turned out there never was a hassle. It turned without CA, without anything, and then after it was sitting. Maybe it was because it was on my mantle and it might have gotten more than normal heat.
Popped.
But my wife came out with the bowl in one hand and about a 4-inch piece of bark in the other hand and said, "Can you do something with this?"
The things you're finding, you've already basically identified it, Barry, is uneven contraction or shrinkage. So the bark is going to dry the fastest. What I mean is, as soon as you cut a piece of green wood in a plank form, you'll see that bark, the surface, the plane of the bark and the wood will not be parallel or continuous in an hour. So if you're going to turn it and it's going to succeed, you'll know in that first hour or two, if it's starting to shrink, you're done. You're not going to win. So the wood, you need to keep it similar moisture content until the whole piece is dry. So turn it and close it up in a bag, leave it in your shop, leave it in an area that doesn't have a really dry environment, and let it dry a little bit. You're more likely to keep that cambium from separating. But bark will often let go 3 years later, 5 years later. It's not going to stay permanently. And the CA, it's a temporary solution. So this is sort of like a cotton candy on something. The bark, it's going to come off eventually. It just will.
So you're saying that little thing I turned over there with the cambium that's so exposed that'll probably fall off?
That bark will likely come off.
But it is species specific. There are some species where the bark will stay on for 40 years. You can see pieces that were turned 40 years ago with bark on. But it's not all wood. You went down to Ellsworth. Carl was just down there. What does Ellsworth say? Not that bark. He takes the chisel to the bark before you even start turning the piece.
Yeah.
It's coming off anyway, so why leave it on?
Yeah, he didn't seem to.
Right. You do a natural edge bowl and you do an interior bowl at his place, and every time he does the natural edge, he goes, just take the bark off because there's no reason to have that fly at you.
And if I think about his called it his inner sanctum, where he has all his pieces displayed. I don't recall seeing any more.
Very little. But this is, whether it's in my glass studio or training a carpenter or turning, whatever, technique is the most important thing, not the finished object when you're starting. And one thing you can do in order to help yourself with technique is avail yourself of one or two species of wood and learn how to discern the subtleties of wood and then expand to another species. But if you're trying to teach yourself how to turn or make something with wood and you're working with a different piece each time, you're SOL. You're never going to get anywhere because you're confounding yourself every time. Every species is different. And the maturity of the tree has something to do with its movement and its features as well. And whether it was a tall tree or a tree that had no vertical challenge, it went wide. If it was fighting for nutrients, if it has a lot of silica, if there are wide growth rings, narrow growth rings, all sorts of little things. Those subtleties will transmit to your final work. So do yourself a favor, if you can. It's really hard to focus like this sometimes, but stick to 1, 2, or 3 species and really try to focus on repeating your work. Practice, practice, and then, by the way, practice. You'll get it.
Well, we have a ton of walnut that
As an example.
Johnny's.
As an example.
And so
But there's another. You guys are talking about practice, 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 but you want about keeping the bark on. But what you've also haven't pointed out is with that wing bowl that John has made there. When you start getting out towards that wing where you're seeing the gouges, you're also on an uneven cut. So there's a gap in holding the tool. So there is a propensity, if you're pushing too hard or something like that, if you're pushing against the wood, or that's your inclination, and you're pushing into the wood, like, with your tool, as soon as it comes into air, it's going to go in, and then it's going to come back out again, and it's going to create a gouge.
right.
And we talked, that's
Right.
why I said you're not putting up downward pressure on the tool rest. You have inward pressure.
Which is what's doing exactly what he said.
So, yeah, exactly. So you have to be careful about that, and to me, that's one of the things you have to practice, regardless of tool things, is how to make that pressure so that you're not actually putting inward pressure on that cut when you're making it. It's only a vertical, and it is very light. I'm not sure that having a catch and just learning how to do it with multiple catches is necessarily the way I would approach it. But
No, you're right.
I still struggle with it. So I understand exactly the gouging you're talking about, John. And if you think practice, 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 well, I've been practicing for 15 years and I still struggle with it. So.
Well, I've also learned, obviously, I think Mike Pisa said it, a tool that's almost sharp will almost cut.
Right.
So, that was okay, but I've taken to sharpening a lot more frequently and taking lighter and lighter cuts, which actually you can also do when the tool is really sharp.
Yes. And you're absolutely right. What Mike said is that if the tool is dull, it will make it even worse for that sort of thing. So making sure you have a razor sharp tool when you're going into makes it so it cuts with a lot less pressure.
Yep.
The kind John pointed out, and that you can see in Thomas's bowl, I have found like a 1 inch or 3/4 inch round nose scraper that you have just immediately beforehand sharpened, put a burr on it. And if there's ever a time to be very careful on advancing it, that's the time. And they just shave off. I mean, they come off super smooth and very fine. I do have a wider, like a 2-inch scraper, but if that thing is fully enveloped in the curve of the bowl, then you are inviting having it fly off on it.
I think the other thing that we don't think about, and maybe you guys do, is that the wood itself when we start turning it thin, it does not have the ability to hold its shape. So it's going to be flexing and going out around if it's green and starting to dry. So it's not always our technique, it's what the wood is that we're using and how thin we've gotten it. And the other thing I'm trying to remember is I see a lot of guys turn like half a bowl or half of a base and let the bottom solid to support all that top, and then work your way down after you have the top done. Am I on the right track or not?
Yes, you must have done that, John, when you turned this with the bowl, right? You turn it down in steps. You
Yeah.
hollow it and then try to make a final cut.
No, I start at the top and I work my way on the edge of the bowl down to the center and just keep working my way towards the bottom.
You worked the hollow till the whole wing was available to you, because that's the other thing, right? If you're working in steps and you cut the final cut on the edge of the wing, then you work another step in and you go further down the wing, you'll definitely have that issue as well, to what he's saying. If you had hollowed that out to wherever the bottom level of your bark is, not the
here.
bottom of the bowl, but the bottom of the natural edge,
Right?
then you've still got enough mass
Oh,
that's not going to flex on you.
right.
But if you try to do a step of half of that distance and then you go the rest of that distance, you've already sort of.
So I certainly have not mastered it, but subsequent natural edge bowls, I kind of did, I think what you suggest, which is I get this to the thickness that I want and it's pretty smooth, no gouges per se. And then I start working my way down to where there's actually enough, it's round, it's not wings. Does that make sense or not?
Yeah, but I'm suggesting that in this instance, you do not.
That would be what you do in a normal bowl without a natural edge, right? Keep working down in steps and thin it out, right? But here, because where you're flexing more is at the wings, because they're not all the way around the bowl, I would go down to the base of the wing of the bark. So whatever that is, 1.25 inches or 1.5 inches or whatever.
So
The bottom level of the bark.
down here.
Down there.
Right.
Flat. And so now you still got all this mass.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's
yeah.
what I've been doing.
And then do the whole wing, then go down farther.
Right,
Yeah.
that's what I've been doing, and it works better.
Yeah.
Along with sharpness and
Pressure down and
Sharpness
lighter
key.
cuts.
Yeah.
And interestingly, when I was first turning, this is a silly analogy, I don't know why it pops into my head. When I used to play softball, I was an outfielder. I never watched the ball. I just catch it and I throw it because I knew where my glove was. But frankly, not quite the same with wood turning. So I discovered that as I was turning, Ellsworth, he gets down and he's like looking right over his tool. He's looking at where it's meeting the wood. And one day, I don't know, I had an epiphany. I did that and I was like, oh, now I understand how the wood is being cut by the tool. And I had never really done that. It was almost like secondhand, okay, I see about where it is. No, so I paid much closer attention to how the tool was meeting the wood and the shavings coming off and where they were coming off of the edge. Because I didn't even understand how that was working initially. I couldn't figure out how it was even cutting wood, right? So watching it and paying really good attention to that, just like when you sharpen the tool. Make sure you see how the tool is meeting the needle or the belt, whatever you're turning.
Using your baseball analogy, when you're using a big glove that's 3 times the size of your hand to catch a ball that's about 1/4 the size of your hand, you don't have to be precise about where your glove is. You only have to be approximate where your glove is. And if you're only approximate where your tool is in turning, you're dead.
Right.
In the water.
Yep.
A question for the experienced bowl turners. When I see some pros on YouTube or in demos, when they're turning the inside of the bowl, they are aggressively like stab, 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 and not pull or push. I mean, eventually it comes down to that. But most of the hollowing is done by like, you're almost creating like a series of concentric steps in there. what is the advantage of the stab, stab, stab versus the pull or push across the entire face?
You're not cutting in grain.
So Mike's clearing end grain.
Yeah, for making the steps like that, you're just going side grain the whole way down because you're just getting rid of the wood anyway. You're not making your final surface. So all you want to do is clear that wood out. The easiest way to do that is to cut into the side grain because, like Mike says, you're not hitting the end grain every time it comes around. Save that final pass for the natural way where you're side grain, end grain, side grain, end grain, but that's your finished cut. That make sense?
Yep. Well, Bill Heaps is at the control desk here, but I'm going to ask a question on his behalf. Bill turned that thin-stemmed vase, what have you, goblet, but it didn't warp much, didn't change shape. I happened to watch Mike Peace's video the other day about you were turning flowers, Mike, letting them warp. And I think you should speak to it, but I think you actually, after you would turn it, you would put a weight on it to ensure that the stem itself was bending. You didn't rely strictly on shrinkage.
Yeah, shrink it. You know, it might move some, but if you really want it pronounced on the stem, you've got to weight it.
Right. And you don't enjoy turning those things out of poplar.
It's kind of stringy.
If you're going to go that thin on that goblet, like he's saying, and to support what Mike is saying, if you take a look at the straight grain, there's no stresses in there to distort. So the only real way you can train to do it is and the reason that somebody like Thomas gets on his bigger pieces is because he's got differential stresses and enough grains or enough growth rings going across it. When you get down to that small, sometimes it's only 3 or 4, even 1 or 2 growth rings you're cutting up, and there's no stress in the wood that causes that to distort as much as you want it to. So the only way to get that is either have it go across grain, in which case it's going to shatter immediately, which I demonstrated quite adequately, thank you, or to do as Mike said, and that is just it's a little bit wet, put a rubber band or do something on it, it'll distort quite nicely. And it's very, very easy to do. You won't crack or do anything like that. In fact, you could take your bolt, the one that you've got right now, and you think it's finished. Well, just take it up to your kettle, boil it, put some steam on it, and you can bend that probably into a pretzel if you wanted to with the diameter without breaking it. Then,
Right.
Well, Doug, is the assumption made when you're turning one of these thin stems from a branch, that the pith is straight?
If you're running, my comment would be that if you're running too close to the pith is probably the weakest part. And I've tried running it up close to the pith, and I've had a real disaster with it. So I try and stay away from the pith because the strength isn't there to turn it.
So the just emerge somewhere on the base and somewhere on the flower or the goblet, and it wouldn't be present in the spindle at all.
Right.
Well, the way that's the way he did it. And I think that was a really good idea. But anytime I've had the pith crossing into the into the stem like that, it just shatters on me.
In this case, the pith was off-centered.
Intentionally?
No.
Oh.
The pith was off-center when I started. When I got down to the diameter, it was off to the side.
Is that the dark line there?
Yeah, that's the dark line. I probably don't have the camera there, but.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I can.
You can see the little black line there.
Yeah.
That's the pith. And if you look at the bottom, you can see the pith's off to the side. So it ended up, my pith is actually running outside of my shaft.
Right.
Now it is still part of the heartwood, just barely. You can see there on the side. Because the hardwood on this crepe myrtle is really different. You can see like the jagged lines around that. Just, I wasn't expecting that when I started turning, and you can see it a little bit better on the bottom.
Was this the first one of these you attempted?
Absolutely. It was just kind of, I was cutting a tree, so green wood. Next day I took the limb and tried to do this because I was thinking what Doug did, and that's just pretty much how it happened. Now this
And that feature halfway down, right at the bottom, halfway down that would have scared the bejesus out of me as far as braking is concerned. So I'm, well done.
You can see how the grain is kind of curling around there.
Yeah, that's a perfect spot for it to break when you're turning. Yeah.
I definitely was sweating. There's no doubt. My first time ever doing this.
You were so
the
skilled with the skew. You hollowed out the goblet.
Yeah, really. You can see the pith in there too.
Wow. So it's a big
How
struggle.
long did that take?
It really didn't take that long. It was only about an hour and a half. It was a little longer, and I just kept making it shorter to the size I wanted.
What speed were you
I
turning?
purposely kept this up higher speed, around 1,000. I get scared when I go over 1,000, so I kept. But it acts like Doug had said, when you're turning it, and you have your finger and you're putting your skew on it with one hand. It is pretty stable, and it's not as scary as I thought it would be.
So how did you have it mounted to turn that?
I had a waist block on the end. Well, it was longer, and I parted it down to this height. So I just clamped it in the jaw.
So you just had set it in a jaw. And how about the other end? Not supported at all?
No, well, at first I did until I hollowed this out. And then I actually put like a little small piece inside to my tailstock, so I can give it a little bit of support there. Let it wobbling around, it's kind of too. I didn't go any thin. I didn't go real thin on this, but it was in there to support it. And then not much tension, just enough to keep it from wobbling, because I didn't want to put too much tension on this and then snap that. Anyhow.
First attempt was pretty decent.
Yeah, and don't forget, if you're talking about that cup turning at 1,000 RPM at the top surface, if it's an inch in diameter, and the stem is say an eighth of an inch of diameter, then the top surface is going 8 times faster than the core is, or that spindle is. So, the surface speed is really, really low, even though your speed on your lathe looks like it's going like gangbusters, because technically the surface speed at the very center is 0. It's an engineering argument, but anyway. So it's, but it just means that it's going a lot, that little center part isn't going nearly as fast as you might think. So going even at 3,000 RPM when you're turning that centerpiece is still slower surface speed than it was when you were doing 1,000 at the cup. So
at the very center, when it's going 0, it's because there's also no material. Yeah. The very center is actually all air at one point.
Which Doug demonstrated.
Yeah, which Doug perfectly demonstrated when you did your nice job.
Sorry.
I had to bring engineering into it somehow, Thomas.
Well, Doug,
Hey guys, sorry, go ahead.
well, then you have to explain, if we go to the North Pole, we can actually stand there and not move as the Earth rotates.
There's no
along
days
us?
at the North Pole. Yeah.
Mike, if you want to try that, just be my guest. It's another thing that Canadians do on a routine basis since we own the North Pole, isn't that it? No, I should say that.
You got to be on the very, very center one.
Yeah, but that wobbles every 2,000 years, so you got to be careful about that one too. You have to stand there for a long time. Guys, I gotta bug off because I gotta get up early in the morning. So thanks a lot for the opportunity, and it's a great conversation.
Thanks, Doug.
Thanks,
Take care. Take care.
Well, we got a couple minutes left. Does anybody else have anything to add?
So I'm been in the space of building a shop. I have a very narrow throat on the lathe, and so I'm trying to work a chainsaw to make circles, and it's a nightmare because I am not good at it at all. So I'm looking into bandsaw. Is 1 3/4 horsepower sufficient for doing things, or do you really need more?
How thick are you cutting?
Well, that's part of what I wanted to figure out. Like, one of the things I suck at is actually making a flat face. And so I was thinking about, I've seen some jigs and stuff like that where you can take a log and put it through a bandsaw clamped and get a flat face, and then you can do your discs and things like that. So
1 1/2, 1 3/4 is flat.
Okay.
It's the blade you're going to use, and that's your throat.
Yeah.
Just think about how high.
Okay.
So
14-inch-ish.
yeah, 14.
Yeah. Okay.
Pretty standard. And
Okay. All right. Thank you.
look at your blade though. Your blade makes all the difference.
That's 3 tooth.
Get a stiff tooth or something.
Yeah.
Definitely. I would suggest the other thing you consider, most 14-inch saws seem to have like a 6-inch throat or 6-inch height.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a 6-inch riser that
Right.
many people add, and then you've got a 12-inch.
Okay. Right.
So it'll go from a 93.5-inch blade to a 104. Yeah,
105.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Thank you.
Just make sure you mention it when you're not using it.
Yeah. Appreciate it.
One of the things I have a sense about is that sandpaper is considered the bad child of wood turning. Why is that? I mean, you guys were spending the last half hour talking about tool marks. The only way to get rid of a tool mark is to sand it, right?
We're not
Or to
putting
make a
there.
better cut.
Don't make them to begin with.
I'm sorry, but I do not trust that you can make a totally toolless mark turning. I gave up on trying to make a totally toolless turning, toolless mark. And I mean, we've talked a good bit about why do we have these marks. Yeah.
So, Jim, not like I've accomplished it yet, but at last year's symposium, Eric, why can't I think of his last name from
Lostrom.
Right.
Lostrom. Yeah.
Lostrom. He did demos, and he left behind some spindles that were going to get tossed in the trash, so I took them home, right? They were going to get thrown away, and he demonstrated, he turned a spindle and didn't sand it, and he turned another spindle and sanded it. And frankly, the one that he didn't sand is better looking because his turning with
It was a skew. He used a
he
skew.
used a skew, and it was so nicely done, whereas the sandpaper kind of fuzzes or blurs the grain. And so the particular ones that he did, he was showing how he could turn it. Now, not all wood's going to offer the same kind of finish, I suppose.
And that was spindle turning.
That was spindle turning, and it needed no sanding. I think sanding probably would have messed it up, for lack of a better word. It wouldn't have made it any more precise than what he did just off the skew. But he can't always do that, I'm sure. But he showed how smooth it can be if you have a nice decent piece of wood and a really sharp tool.
That's because he always had his exercises you had to do before you stood in front of the lathe.
Like this?
Yep. You had to do the jig and the dance and the whole bit. So.
Well, maybe that's what you're not doing that you need to do. Just rid of the tool.
You just answered your own question, Jim.
Yeah, really.
Well, I've never learned to dance, and that's the one thing I'm disappointed about my teen years. So I still can't dance.
Well,
Not even in front of a lathe.
If you move to Lancaster, we'll teach you. Before I forget, next month, I think the challenge is jigs, correct?
Yes, it is.
So,
Barry's got the whole 4 hours.
There's a chance for you, Jim. Jigs next week.
jigs.
Dance a jig.
Dancing jigs, Jim.
Yeah, my jigs all dance. I tell you, my jigs know how to dance.
All right. So, Jim, I think tonight was actually interesting. I don't know what y'all think, but it would have been good to have a few more experienced turners here. But still, I appreciated everybody's comments. My notion for next week or next month is Barry certainly has his share of jigs, but others bring your jigs in. But I'd like to spend a little bit more time talking about people's jigs that they've done and what they find is useful. And, you know, some people turn things without using a jig, and other people have a jig for almost doing anything and everything. So that's my suggestion for next month.
Cool. Thanks, John. Thanks, John.
Okay.
Thank you, John.
Are we done?
Thank you,
Okay.
John.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right.